If we understand God's holiness, that person over there is not the standard. God, who is the holy, righteous judge of the universe, he is the standard. And so when we can help ourselves and our kids understand God's holiness, then we can see our sin in its proper light.
We were talking about, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people, to bad people, to everybody, to the world? I mean, why is there so much sin in the world? And you answered it perfectly. And that was, I asked that question because we recently, my youngest daughter asked that question to me. She discovered that a friend of hers had been really hurt, and she was just broken over it. She said, "Why, Mom? Why does a good God allow bad things to happen? Why? And she was just crying over that. And I told her the same thing. I gave, basically the same answer that you gave. And as we were talking through that, she was so angry at this other person who had sinned against her friend. And I said, and she said, how could that person ever be forgiven? I said, what you have to understand is, as hard as it is to forgive, God shed his blood for that person as much as he shed his blood for you and for me. We're all sinful. And as when Adam and Eve sinned and sin entered the world, it was fair game for everybody. And I shouldn't say fair game. It was unfair game, really, for everybody. But like you said, Jesus sent his son to pay the price, to pay the penalty for everyone. And I'm so grateful for his attributes, for his goodness, for his faithfulness and his love and his kindness in our lives, because we don't deserve it either. We tend to, I think, scale sin. Well, I'm a sinner, but my sin isn't quite as bad as that other person's sin. I'm not really as bad as my neighbor. And I think we sometimes can justify our sin that way. And in reality, sin is sin is sin. It comes with different consequences, of course. But I want to talk through some of, as we're thinking about that, some of the attributes that God does share with us, in big girl terms. He really does share with us these attributes so that we can become more like him, so that we can understand his forgiveness. Because until we understand really who he is as God, it is really, really hard to understand why God allows bad things to happen and understand why we should forgive other people for their sins. So let's talk through some of those attributes that God shares with us and invites us really to reflect.
I really love the way that you set up this question, Yvette, because you hit on some really important things, just these things that we wrestle through personally and emotionally and intellectually to try to understand, like, we know that this isn't right. We know that this is unjust. And, as you said, like, all sin is against God. And that's where understanding God's attributes come in, because we inherently understand, that when we, speak harshly with our child, that's vastly different than the pedophile that is sexually abusing a child. Like, are they both sin? Yes, but like, that is a vastly more grievous sin. And we even see in the law of Moses, that God gave to the Israelites, there was different punishments for different crimes. And Jesus says, he who knew much, but still chose not to do it, he's going to be punished with many stripes, versus him who didn't know, will be punished with fewer stripes. And so we might say, well, I'm not like that person over there. And that's true. Our sin, we might have never committed as heinous a crime. But if we understand God's holiness, that person over there is not the standard. God, who is the holy, righteous judge of the universe, he is the standard. And so when we can help ourselves and our kids understand God's holiness, then we can see our sin in its proper light. That it doesn't matter if we've never treated somebody in the way, that person over there has treated them. We have still sinned against the holy God. And God calls us to reflect his holiness, that he gives us holiness in Jesus. He gives us positional holiness in Jesus. But then we are called to progressive holiness, to be conformed more into the image of Jesus. So we first have to understand God's holiness. And then two other attributes that God invites us to reflect that are so important for us to understand, to understand some of these difficult topics, I think, are God's justice and God's mercy, that we have to understand that God is just. He always does what is right, and he punishes sin. And we give kids the example, just a little kid example that they can understand. What if your brother came in your room when you weren't there and he took your toy truck, your favorite toy truck, and he played with it without asking, and then he broke it. And then he just left it in his room and didn't do anything with it. Well, when you found that out and you told your parents what happened, what would happen if your parents just said, it's not that big a deal. We're going to let it slide this time. You would be so angry. Why? Because that's not just. Your parents had not treated you fairly. They had not treated your brother fairly by implementing a punishment or a consequence for the way that he sinned against you. And we just inherently know that justice is a good thing, that God would not be a good God if he did not punish us and everyone else for their sin. And we understand this. If there's a police officer who turns a blind eye to a crime because it's committed by somebody that he or she loves, that's unjust. That's similarly if that police officer, incarcerates someone who did not, commit a crime. That is unjust. And so we understand this justice, but then it's not that when God sends Jesus, he just kind of turns a blind eye and is like, it's okay, your sin's not that big a deal. No, God is merciful. He does not give us the punishment that we deserve because of Jesus. That when Jesus was on the cross, he bore God's wrath toward our sin. That, that's why he calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because for the first time in eternity, he was bearing the weight of sin. He was bearing the Father's wrath toward that sin. And that's actually a term that we use even with these little, kids 4 on up, that God's wrath, God's right, just anger towards our sin, Jesus bore that. And so every single sin that has ever been committed will be dealt with justly. That there will be a just punishment for every single sin. Either that person will pay, they may pay some consequences here on this earth for that sin, or they may get away scot-free, in this life. But the punishment will come with eternity separated from God in hell, or that punishment was already placed on Jesus. So helping our kids understand, see biblically, and understand the concept of holiness, that, it doesn't matter if we have committed lots of quote unquote little sins, or if we've committed grievous sins. All sin is against God. It does not meet his standards, so that they understand God's holiness. And then the fact that God is just. In order to be a good God, God must punish sin, because he would be an unjust judge if he just let things slide. But we don't have to pay the penalty for our sin because God is merciful. And then we talk about, how do we reflect these things? How do we reflect these things? Well, people who are in positions of authority, they need to judge justly. They need to reflect God in enacting justice, whether it's a parent, whether it's church leaders, whether it's law enforcement officers, whether it's people in the government, that they are required to judge justly. And then we are to treat others justly. And then we can be merciful to others. We can extend mercy and forgive others of their sins against us because we have been forgiven by God. So I really, again, Yvette, I love the way that you set up that question, because I think it shows how learning the attributes of God is not just some, it's not just some intellectual exercise. It's like, check, now we know who God is. It's like, in order to correctly understand reality, we have to have a true understanding of who God is.
Homeschool Insights is sponsored by CTC Math. If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com and try it for free. For more great homeschool inspiration and resources, listen to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday.